Well, Dirava, first of all, thank you very much for your question. The European Union's commitment to advance the human rights agenda globally, including in China, is based on Article 21 of the Treaty on the European Union, and it is aligned with existing obligations under international human rights law. The EU is determined to continue to act as a global force in the promotion and protection of human rights and democracy around the world, including in China. Global dependencies, which are in fact often interdependencies, do not constitute a valid reason for compromising on human rights, the rule of law, and good governance.
Well, I mean, yes, of course, there's, I think, a lessons learned also for us, also in terms of human rights, because the Ukraine war and China's silent acknowledgement of Moscow's actions shows us that China is going the same path, a path that we have not intended. We always intended to change China through economic means. In German, Wandel durch Handel, a very popular slogan in Germany. And I think there's no illusion anymore within Europe that this approach has failed. So we are standing in front of the challenge to reframe our relationship with these kind of powers, and defending human rights is naturally a part of it, because if we want to uphold our own values and norms, then we cannot do without always mentioning violations of human rights, in particular in a country like China that is so big and has started very extreme measures in violating human rights. And I'm not only talking, of course, about the obvious cases of Hong Kong and Xinjiang in Tibet, but also their own people. If we look at the total control that the Chinese regime has imposed on its own population, we can see a totalitarian state emerging, and this is not in our interest. And I think Ukraine and the question of dependencies did serve as a sort of wake-up call for our policymakers in Europe to try to redefine their relationship and ask how can we also separate maybe economic interests from human rights interests. And I think there is a rethinking happening right now. It started already before the Ukraine war. So in the EU-China strategy from 2019, China for the very first time is not only mentioned as a partner, but also as a competitor and as a systemic rival. And the systemic rivalry is in precise this. We are talking about rivalry of systems here. And I do expect that Germany and the EU in the coming years and probably very near future is going to look at this definition again and maybe try to redefine it. So I would tell her that also here we see a kind of rethink happening. And I actually I was positively surprised, in particular in recent years, that I would find an increasing alignment of EU positions regarding China. It's true that just maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was a bigger divide, and Germany was part of it because of its economic interests. But if we were talking about violations of international rules or violations of human rights, I think in particular in this regard, there has been an increasing alignment. A couple of years ago, for instance, there was a ruling by the EU on the South China Sea, and that China's claims to the South China Sea are unjustified. And there were a couple of countries that pressured the EU that much that the statement came out eventually quite weak, in a quite weak language. Later on, there were also statements on the human rights violations. And also here we could see a couple of countries that were looking at receiving Chinese investments and closer relationship with China that vetoed these kind of statements. By today, I would say it's only one country that is vetoing these kind of statements, and that remains Hungary. So the tide has a little bit shifted. We are not looking anymore, it's not a picture anymore of a divided Europe, but of a united Europe with 1 or 2 black sheeps, I would say, to put it simply. This is not very scientific, but I think this is a good summary of this. And then also we were I think you were also probably hinting at the countries in Eastern and Central Europe that were in particular attracted to Chinese investment. And China has launched a charm offensive towards these countries in particular, offering them big investments. And in return, without ever spelling it out officially, of course, expecting support on these kind of sensitive topics. But in particular, after the Ukraine war started, I would argue that also these countries have shifted because for them, the war in Ukraine is and the threat from Russia is perceived in a very, very extreme way, in an emotional way, much more than in Germany. And there's a huge disappointment in China that China is not doing anything to stop this war and to use its leverage in Russia. So I think this kind of approachment towards China is coming to an end, from what we see at the moment, at least.
Well, dear Stephanie, the EU and its 27 member states share the very same universal values and abide by the same obligations under international human rights law to promote and protect human rights worldwide. I can assure you that bilateral and global priorities and interests are not advanced to the detriment of human rights. Dear Peter, your question is very timely. On the 14th of September 2022, the European Commission has proposed a regulation that will prohibit the marketing of products made with forced labor on the EU single market. The proposal is currently being discussed under the so-called ordinary legislative procedure involving the European Parliament and the Council of the EU. The proposal of the European Commission follows a comprehensive approach and covers all products, no matter where they were made. This includes products manufactured in the EU, but also in the rest of the world. If the proposal is adopted in its current form, competent authorities in all the 27 EU member states will take a risk-based approach in their assessment and investigations. This means that they will focus their enforcement actions on products, companies, regions, and countries where forced labor is likely to appear. This proposal complements the legislative proposal of February 2022 on sustainable and responsible corporate behavior throughout global value chains, which is equally under discussion under the ordinary legislative procedure.
I do agree with him. I think we are still at the beginning of a long path, but at least I would say we are at the beginning. So this is already the thinking in politics, not only in Germany, but EU-wide and also worldwide, I would say. I mentioned in German before the supply chain law of Germany, and there's a debate on imposing this as well for as Europe as a whole. The US already has something in place. As I said, it's very difficult to implement it in practice, but I think we are learning by doing. This is also a part of being in the European Union, that everything might take a little bit longer time, but I think the eventual goal is exactly what you are suggesting, meaning that there has to be sanctions imposed also on companies that use forced labor, or where we can prove it at least. And we have to, of course, be very careful in conducting our own economic relationships in the future. Of course, the companies need to also acknowledge this. And I would argue that not all companies are doing this yet. So this is also a process that needs to happen among the industries, in particular within Germany, but also in other European countries. But I think it is leading to real actions. And of course, for the policymakers, you're right. I mean, statements can be seen as very weak, but they are important nonetheless. So I would hope that we continue making statements. And then there's also the practical approach towards China, where China is kind of trying to misuse our dialogues or actions on human rights. An example was the visit during May this year of the UN human rights representative to Xinjiang, the first time China allowed a UN representative to visit Xinjiang in 17 years. but it was completely misused by the Chinese. In their propaganda, they said, you know, she congratulated China on their great human rights system. And of course, this is something where in real actions, we can be very much more careful to not allow China to misuse us. We also have human rights dialogues with China, but by now we should also ask whether we should continue to have them if they are misused as such in the Chinese narrative. So it might be a better, clearer signal to China to say we will stop these dialogues unless we can actually talk about contents, and we will not visit Xinjiang unless we can really go into the forced labor camps and talk to the Uyghurs. So there is a range of stuff that still needs to be done. So I agree. We need a little bit more real actions.